The synagogue in Capernaum is full. It is the Sabbath. The lamps are lit. The scrolls have been read. And somewhere in the middle of the congregation stands a man with a hand that has not opened or closed properly in years, a withered hand. The muscles gone slack, the tendons tightened into something that no longer works the way a hand is supposed to work. He is not the reason everyone is tense. The reason everyone is tense is standing at the front of the room. Jesus of Nazareth is there. And the Pharisees. Mark tells us this plainly, without apology. The Pharisees are watching him. Not listening. Watching. They have already decided what they think of this man from Galilee who heals people and quotes Torah back at them and says things in synagogues that make everyone go quiet. They are not there to learn. They are there to catch him. They are about to get exactly what they came for. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. What happens next, in this synagogue and in 4 other confrontations scattered across the Gospels, is not an accident. It is not Jesus being careless. It is not Jesus failing to read the room. Every single time Jesus healed someone on the Sabbath, he did it with full knowledge of what it would cost him. And the cost was staggering. Here is the detail that stops me every time I read it. The Gospel of Mark, the shortest, fastest, most action-packed of the 4 Gospels, records its very first murder plot in chapter 3. Not after the Sermon on the Mount. Not after Jesus walks on water. Not after he raises someone from the dead. The first time anyone in Mark and Apos' Gospel sits down and seriously plans to kill Jesus is after he heals a man in Apos' hand. On the Sabbath, we are going to come back to that moment. We are going to follow that thread all the way to Jerusalem. But first, you need to understand what the Sabbath actually was. Because without that, none of what Jesus did makes any sense. The Hebrew word is Shabbat. It comes from the root Shabbat, which means to cease, to stop, not to sleep, not to collapse from exhaustion. To stop intentionally. When Genesis tells us God rested on the 7th day, the word does not mean he was tired. It means he looked at everything he had made and said, "It is complete." The stopping was the declaration. The rest was the announcement that the work was finished. By the time Jesus walked into that synagogue in Capernaum, the Sabbath had become something else entirely. The religious scholars of his day, working from the oral traditions that would eventually be written down in the Mishnah, had identified 39 categories of prohibited labor for the Sabbath. 39. Plowing, reaping, tying knots, writing, carrying an object from one domain to another. These were not fringe rules. They were the architecture of Jewish public life. To observe the Sabbath was to declare your identity as the people of God. The historian Philo of Alexandria, writing in the generation just before Jesus, called the Sabbath the birthday of the world. It was that significant. And healing, unless a life was in immediate danger, was on the prohibited list. A withered hand was not an emergency. A bent back was not an emergency. A man who had been lying by a pool for 38 years was not an emergency. Under the rules as the Pharisees understood them, all of those people could wait one more day. Jesus did not make them wait. This is not a story about rule breaking. This is not a story about religion versus relationship. This is not a story about Jesus being anti-Jewish. He was Jewish. He quoted the Torah from memory. He observed the feasts. He read from the scrolls in synagogues across Galilee. This is a story about the most deliberate theological argument in the history of the world, made not with ink and parchment, but with human bodies. With a hand that opened. With a back that straightened. With eyes that saw for the first time. 5 healings. 5 confrontations. 1 argument. Building in intensity across 3 years, until it finally cost him everything. It starts with grain. One Sabbath, Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field. The grain is ripe. The disciples are hungry. And they do what hungry people walking through a field naturally do. They reach out, pluck a few heads of grain, rub them between their palms to separate the chaff, and eat. The Pharisees are watching. Of course they are watching. End quote. Look, end quote, they say to Jesus. End quote. Your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath. End quote. Now, you need to understand what they are actually accusing the disciples of. They are not accusing them of stealing. Mosaic law actually permitted travelers to eat from the edge of a field. What they are accusing them of is reaping and threshing, 2 of the 39 prohibited categories of Sabbath labor. The disciples rubbing grain between their palms to separate the chaff. That was technically threshing. A few stalks of grain plucked from a field. That was technically reaping. This is what the system had become. A hungry man eating grain on a walk was a Sabbath violation. Jesus does not apologize. He does not explain that the disciples did not realize. He goes straight to the Torah, straight to the story every Pharisee in earshot knows by heart. He says, "Have you never read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? David went into the house of God and ate the showbread, the consecrated bread set before the Lord, which only the priests were permitted to eat. He ate it. He gave it to his men, and the text does not condemn him for it." Stay with me, because Jesus is making a precise argument here. He is not saying rules do not matter. He is saying that when human need collides with religious ritual, and you have to choose, you choose the human. David chose the human. God did not condemn David for it. And if the Pharisees want to condemn hungry men for eating grain, they are holding people to a standard stricter than God himself applied to Israel and Apos, greatest king. Then Jesus says the line that changes everything. End quote. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. End quote. The Greek word is Kyrios, Lord, Master, Owner. Jesus is not saying he has an opinion about the Sabbath. He is not saying he has a new interpretation of the Sabbath. He is saying the Sabbath belongs to him. He owns it. He is the one it was always pointing toward. The institution the Pharisees had built their entire authority around. He is claiming it as his property. That is not a small statement. That is a declaration of war. And then he walks into the synagogue. The man with the withered hand is already there. Mark tells us the Pharisees are watching, specifically watching, to see if Jesus will heal him, so they can bring a formal accusation. This is not a spontaneous confrontation. This is a setup. They have positioned themselves in the room. They are waiting. Jesus knows. He can see their faces. He can read the silence the way a man reads weather, the way the air goes still before something breaks. He does not lower his voice. He does not pull the man aside quietly. He does not wait until after the service. He says, end quote, "Come forward," end quote. The man stands in the middle of the congregation. Everyone is looking at him now, at the hand that hangs wrong at his side, the fingers that will not close, the wrist that tells the story of years of limitation. And Jesus looks at the Pharisees. Mark says he looked at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their hearts, and asks them a question. End quote. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? End quote. They do not answer. Mark says they were silent. And that silence is one of the most devastating moments in the entire gospel. Because the question has only one honest answer. Of course it is lawful to do good. Of course you should save a life when you can. But to give that answer is to hand Jesus the argument. So they say nothing. He heals the man. Right there, in the synagogue, on the Sabbath, in front of everyone. And Mark tells us, without any dramatic build-up, without any pause, that the Pharisees walked straight out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians about how to destroy him. The Herodians, the political allies of the Roman-backed ruler. The people who, under any other circumstances, the Pharisees despised. They hated the Herodians the way you hate a collaborator, someone who made peace with the occupying power. But they hated Jesus more. They were willing to reach across every political and theological division they had to get rid of him. Over a hand. Over a healing. On a Sabbath morning in Capernaum. That is the first murder plot in the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 3, verse 6. But it gets stranger. Years into his ministry, Jesus is teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath. A woman is there. She has been there, or somewhere like there, for 18 years. For 18 years, she has not stood up straight. Her spine has bent her forward. Luke describes it as a spirit of infirmity that bound her, and she has spent nearly 2 decades looking at the ground, at feet, at dirt, at the bottom of walls. The world above her shoulders has been closed to her for 18 years. Jesus sees her. He calls her forward. End quote. Woman, you are freed from your disability. End quote. The Greek word he uses is apoluo, released, untied, set loose. It is the same word used for releasing a prisoner from chains. The same word used when a soldier is discharged from service. Jesus is not treating this woman and Apos' body as a medical case. He is treating it as a captivity, and he is the one with the authority to end it. He lays his hands on her, and she stands up straight. For the first time in 18 years, she sees the ceiling. She sees faces at eye level. She sees the sky, and the ruler of the synagogue is furious. He does not address Jesus directly. Maybe he does not dare. He turns to the crowd and says, "There are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, not on the Sabbath day." Jesus answers him the way a teacher answers a student who has missed the entire point. End quote. "You hypocrite." End quote. Not you hypocrites, you. Singular. Personal. End quote. Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? End quote. You untie your animals on the Sabbath. Every week, without a second thought, because the animal needs water and you love the animal, and of course you untie it. But a woman, a daughter of Abraham, the only time in all 4 Gospels he ever uses that phrase for anyone. A daughter of Abraham has been bound for 18 years, and you want her to wait one more day? Luke says the crowd rejoiced. Luke says the woman and Apos, as opponents, were put to shame. And somewhere in the crowd, the woman is still standing straight, shoulders back, chin up, seeing the world at full height for the first time since before most of the people in the room could remember. 3 confrontations, 3 healings, each one deliberate, each one pressing the same argument, that the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. That mercy outranks ritual. That freedom is not a violation of God and Apos' law. Freedom is God and Apos' law. But we are not done, because up to this point, these confrontations have been local, synagogues in Galilee, regional towns, crowds that could be dismissed. What happens next moves the argument to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, the stakes are no longer a murder plot whispered between Pharisees and politicians. In Jerusalem, the stakes are everything. If this is landing differently than you expected, if you came here thinking the Sabbath controversies were minor footnotes, and you are realizing they were the spine of the entire conflict, subscribe so you do not miss where this goes. Hit the bell, because it gets darker before it gets glorious. Jerusalem during a festival is a city that does not sleep. Pilgrims from every corner of the Jewish world crowd into streets that were not built to hold them. The smell of sacrifice hangs over the Temple Mount. Vendors and money changers and priests and soldiers move through the same narrow corridors. It is loud and crowded and charged with the energy of a people who believe God lives in the building at the center of their city. And near the Sheep Gate, near the north wall, just outside the temple complex, there is a pool. The pool is called Bethesda. In Aramaic, the word means house of mercy. It was surrounded by 5 covered colonnades, 5 roofed walkways, and they were filled with people. Blind people, lame people, people with diseases that had no name and no cure. They were waiting for the water to move. The tradition held that when the water stirred, the first person in was healed. So they waited, day after day, in the shadow of the most sacred site in Judaism, in the city where God was said to dwell. They waited. One man had been waiting for 38 years. 38 years. Think about that number for a moment. 38 years is longer than many people in that crowd had been alive. It is a generation. It is a career. It is most of a life. And this man had spent all of it, or most of it, by this pool, waiting for someone to help him into the water, waiting for his moment, waiting. John tells us Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had already been there a long time. In a crowd of thousands, in a city of tens of thousands, Jesus walks to this specific man and asks him a question that sounds almost too simple to be serious. End quote. Do you want to be healed? End quote. The man does not say yes. He explains why yes is impossible. There is no one to help him into the water. Every time the water moves, someone else gets there first. He has been trying. He has been here. But there is no one. He does not know who he is talking to. Jesus says, end quote, rise. Pick up your bed and walk, end quote. And the man does. 38 years of waiting ends in a single sentence. He picks up his mat and he walks. The Jewish leaders do not see the healing. They see the mat. They find the man walking through Jerusalem carrying his bedroll and they stop him. End quote. It is the Sabbath, end quote. They say, end quote. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed, end quote. The man explains that the one who healed him told him to carry it. They ask who that was. He does not know. Jesus had slipped away into the crowd. Later, Jesus finds him in the temple, and he says something that sounds like a warning dressed as a blessing, end quote. See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you, end quote. The man goes and tells the Jewish leaders it was Jesus who healed him. And then Jesus says something that no one in that courtyard is prepared for. They confront him about the Sabbath, about the healing, about telling a man to carry his mat in violation of the law. And Jesus looks at them and says, and quote, "My Father is working until now, and I am working," end quote. Pay attention to this, because what Jesus just said would have landed like a stone in still water in the minds of every Pharisee within earshot. The rabbinical tradition acknowledged something that created a genuine theological puzzle. God must work on the Sabbath. God sustains every heartbeat, every breath, every birth, every death, continuously, without interruption, including on the seventh day. The Sabbath commandment applied to humans. It could not apply to God, because if God stopped working for a single Sabbath, the universe would cease to exist. Jesus says, "My Father works, and I work with him." He is not claiming to be a healer who works miracles. He is claiming to do what only God does, to sustain, to restore, to give life, because he and the Father are doing the same work. John does not leave you to figure out whether the Pharisees understood the implication. He tells you directly, they sought to kill him, not only because he broke the Sabbath, but because he called God his own Father, making himself equal with God. The Sabbath argument has just become something else entirely. And still he was not finished. One Sabbath, Jesus sees a man who has been blind since birth. His disciples asked the question that most people in that culture would have asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents?" Because suffering must be someone and Apos' fault. Because disability must be punishment. That is the theology they have inherited, and they want Jesus to confirm it. Jesus says, neither. Not his sin. Not his parents and Apos' sin. He was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Then Jesus does something deliberately, almost provocatively physical. He spits on the ground. He makes mud with the saliva. He puts the mud on the man and Apos' eyes and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. The man goes. He washes. He comes back seeing. Now, the act of making mud is itself a Sabbath violation under the Mishnaic code. Kneading, one of the 39 prohibited categories, included combining substances to form a new consistency. Clay, mortar, mud made from spit and dirt. Jesus did not have to make mud to heal this man. He had healed with a word. He had healed with a touch. He chose the mud. He chose the method that made the Sabbath question impossible to avoid. The Pharisees investigate. They pull on the man and Apos' parents. They question the man himself, twice. The first time, some of them say, "This man cannot be from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." Others say, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" John tells us there was a division among them. They cannot agree on the theology, but they agree on the response. They throw the healed man out of the synagogue. He has been blind his whole life. He has just received the most extraordinary gift any human being can imagine. And the institution that was supposed to celebrate the works of God has expelled him for it, because the work was done on the wrong day. Jesus hears that they threw him out, and he goes and finds him. End quote. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" End quote. Jesus asks. The man says, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Jesus says, "You have seen him. He is the one speaking to you now." The man says, "Lord, I believe." And he worships him. 5 confrontations. 5 healings. 5 times the system looked at a miracle and called it a crime. But if you have been tracking the temperature of this opposition, if you have been watching it across these 5 stories, you have noticed something. It is not staying the same. It is rising. From a whispered plot in Capernaum, to an open accusation in Jerusalem, to a formal inquest, to expulsion from the community, to a death warrant. Which of these 5 healings hit you the hardest? The man who waited 38 years, or the man who was thrown out the same day he received his sight? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Because we are about to follow that rising temperature all the way to its source. And when we get there, you are going to see that the Sabbath was never a side argument. It was the accelerant. Let us go back to Capernaum. Chapter 3 of Mark. The man with the withered hand is standing in the middle of the synagogue. Jesus has just healed him. The hand works. The fingers open and close. And the Pharisees walk out and immediately begin plotting with the Herodians to destroy him. I told you we would come back to that moment. Here it is. That is verse 6 of chapter 3. Mark and Apos' gospel began in chapter 1. 6 verses into chapter 3, before the feeding of the 5,000, before the transfiguration, before a single resurrection, the religious establishment has already decided that Jesus must die. And the thing that triggered it was not a blasphemous claim. It was not a political threat. It was a hand, a healed hand, on a Sabbath morning. Now watch what happens as the years pass. John chapter 5, Pool of Bethesda, ends with the leaders seeking to kill Jesus, not only for healing on the Sabbath, but for calling God his Father. John chapter 7, Jesus references the Bethesda healing directly, months later, and says, "If a man can be circumcised on the Sabbath to fulfill the law of Moses, why are you furious at me for healing a man and Apos? His whole body on the Sabbath?" John chapter 10, they pick up stones to throw at him. John chapter 11, after he raises Lazarus from the dead, the chief priests and Pharisees call a council and say, "If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him." And from that day on, John tells us, they made plans to put him to death. Draw a line through all of it. Mark 3, verse 6, John 5, verse 18, John 7, John 10, John 11, verse 53. Every escalation in the plot to kill Jesus runs through or alongside the Sabbath question. Not the question of his identity alone, though that was there. Not the question of his miracles alone, though that was there too. It was the Sabbath. Every time he healed on that day, he was not just helping a person. He was making the same declaration, louder, in a new location, with a new body as the evidence. The Sabbath was not a side issue in the opposition to Jesus. It was the accelerant. Here is what I want you to sit with. Imagine you have been sick for a long time. Not days, not weeks, longer than that. Long enough that you have stopped explaining it to new people because the explanation takes too long and the sympathy runs out before the illness does. Long enough that you have reorganized your entire life around the limitation, around what you cannot do, where you cannot go, how long you can stand before you have to sit, how many steps before you have to stop. You have been to the waiting rooms. You have filled out the forms. You have heard the words, "Not much more we can do," and come back in 6 months. And after enough of those appointments, something quietly closes in you. Not hope exactly, more like the expectation of hope. You stop expecting that someone is going to walk through a door specifically for you. That is the Pool of Bethesda. That is John chapter 9. A man who has never seen a sunrise, never seen his mother and Apos' face, sitting by the road every day of his life while the world moves around him in darkness. And into both of those situations, Jesus does not send a representative. He does not announce a healing service. He does not ask for volunteers. He walks to the specific person in a crowd of thousands at Bethesda on a road outside Jerusalem, and he stops for them. Specifically, this is what every Sabbath healing was saying, in the language of human bodies instead of theological argument. You are not a rule to be enforced. You are not a case to be evaluated. You are not a violation waiting to happen. You are a person, and I came for people. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Colossae years after the resurrection, would say it plainly. The Sabbath, he wrote, was a shadow of things to come. The substance, the solid reality casting that shadow, belongs to Christ. The writer of Hebrews would say it another way. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Not a day, a person. A rest that does not depend on the calendar or the rules, or whether you carried your mat across the wrong boundary in Jerusalem. The Sabbath was always a shadow, and shadows do not exist on their own. They require a source of light, and a solid object standing between the light and the ground. The Sabbath was the shadow. The law was the shadow. The temple was the shadow. Jesus was the substance that had been casting them all along. He did not break the Sabbath the way a criminal breaks a law. He broke it the way you break a shell, to get to what is inside. And he knew. He knew from the moment he told that man in Capernaum to stretch out his hand. He knew from the moment he said, "Rise and pick up your mat at Bethesda." He knew from the moment he put mud on a blind man and Apos' eyes and told him to go wash. Every healing was a choice. Every Sabbath was a decision. Every confrontation was entered with open eyes and a steady pulse and the full knowledge that the people in the room were already counting his offenses. He healed them anyway, not because he was reckless, not because he wanted to provoke, but because a woman had been bent double for 18 years and it was the Sabbath and the Sabbath was made for her. And if not now, when? If not him, who? This is not a story about a day of the week. This is not a story about ancient religious politics. This is not a story about a man who kept running afoul of the authorities by accident. This is a story about a God who looked at every person the system had decided could wait and decided they could not. 3 things to take with you. First, the Sabbath controversies were not accidents, and they were not footnotes. They were a 5-act theological argument that Jesus made with human bodies, with a hand, a spine, 2 eyes, a mat, and 38 years of waiting. Every healing was a sentence in that argument. Every confrontation was a paragraph. And the conclusion of the argument was written not in ink, but in the events of a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem, when the one who claimed to be Lord of the Sabbath was lifted up on a cross, and on the 3rd day rose. Second, every person Jesus healed on the Sabbath had been told, in one way or another, to wait. The system had decided they were not an emergency. The rules had classified their suffering as something that could be managed at a more convenient moment. Jesus looked at every single one of them and disagreed. You are not a rule to be enforced. You are not a case to be managed. You are a person. And if there is anything these 5 healings say to you directly, to whatever you have been carrying, whatever you have been waiting beside, however long you have been told your moment has not arrived yet, it is this. He does not make people wait for mercy. Third, he knew what it would cost him. He knew from Capernaum. He knew from Bethesda. He knew from the road outside Jerusalem, where a blind man washed mud from his eyes and saw the sky for the first time. He knew the Pharisees were counting. He knew the Herodians were being contacted. He knew the council was meeting. And he healed them anyway, because a woman bent double for 18 years was more important than his own safety, and a man who had never seen a sunrise was worth more than the approval of every religious authority in Jerusalem. He knew the cost. He paid it. For them. For you. Which of these 5 people stays with you? The man who waited 38 years, the woman who finally stood straight, the man who was thrown out the day he received his sight. Tell me below. I want to know which one hit you. The Sabbath said, rest. Jesus said, I am your rest.